The red-hot iron left a perfect mark on bare skin. A circle burned deep, stamped with the initials of an owner, placed carefully on the left thigh, where no tunic could ever hide it. The girl did not scream. She had no tears left. At her feet, the marble floor of the Athenian agora darkened with fresh blood. Just a few steps away, free citizens celebrated the triumphs of democracy. It was the year 430 BCE, the golden age of Athens. That mark was not the punishment of a criminal. It was a brand of ownership. She was 12 years old, bought for less money than the price of a loaf of barley bread. In classical Athens, the bodies of thousands of women told a story philosophers chose not to write. A story of a system that turned human flesh into property, sexual violence into law, and suffering into public revenue. While Socrates spoke of virtue in shaded gardens, while Pericles praised equality before the law, a few streets away, the most organized and legally protected trade in female bodies in the ancient world operated in full daylight. And the most disturbing part? It wasn't that it existed. It was that no one questioned it. This is the story of thousands of nameless women whose broken bodies financed the glory of Athens, whose pain paid for its temples, its theaters, and its democracy. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Ancient Grim History. Hit the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. To understand how sexual slavery became normal in Athens, we go back to the 6th century BCE, when Solon's reforms laid the foundations of democracy. For free Athenian men, these reforms represented justice and order. But hidden inside was a fatal contradiction. The freedom of some citizens was built directly on the total enslavement of others. Girls entered Athens through three main paths. Some were born enslaved, inheriting bondage before they could speak. Others were taken during wars. But most were sold by their own families when hunger and despair erased any remaining choice. There was no minimum age. Surviving documents mention girls as young as 7 being prepared for use, trained before their bodies had even matured. Once purchased, they were taken to the Ergasteria, specialized workshops where human beings were sorted like livestock. The most beautiful were assigned to elite symposia. Those considered average were sent to brothels near the port. Those judged ugly, weak, or sick were pushed into the most degraded districts where any man could use them for the price of a loaf of bread. But every one of them, without exception, was branded with hot iron. The pain was intentional. The scar was permanent. It carried a single message: this body does not belong to you. It never has. It never will. Their owners did not call them women. They called them andrapoda, men's feet, a term that reduced human beings to walking tools. Under Solon's law, killing a sexual slave carried the same penalty as destroying a plow, a fine paid to the owner for damaged property. There was no legal concept of rape against them because in the eyes of the law, they lacked the capacity to consent or to refuse. The Athenian state did not merely tolerate this trade. It organized it. Brothels required licenses. Every sexual transaction was taxed. Officials were appointed to inspect enslaved women regularly, ensuring they remained fit for use. These inspections were not moral judgments. They were quality control. Tax records reveal the scale. Between 15 and 20% of the Athenian state's revenue came from the sexual trade. That money funded public buildings, religious festivals, theatrical performances, and even the schools where philosophers lectured about virtue and human dignity. The same democracy that praised equality depended financially on systematic exploitation. Wisdom was paid for with blood. Beauty was built on pain. Freedom rested on invisible chains. And Athens went further. It found a way to transform sexual violence itself into sacred ritual during the Great Dionysia. While tragedies about compassion and justice played on stage, customs that denied those very ideals were carried out just beyond the theater walls. The city of reason and art sustained itself through practices that turned faith into an instrument of control. If you're still watching, drop a comment right now and tell me, do you think modern societies could hide horrors like this today? The system pulled nearly every layer of Athenian society into its machinery. Slaves built and repaired the brothels. Artisans forged locks and shackles. Physicians performed abortions, not to heal, but to return bodies to circulation. Priests blessed rituals that turned exploitation into duty. Even free Athenian women sometimes served as overseers. No part of the city stood outside the system. The placement of the brothels was deliberate. The largest establishments clustered around the agora so citizens could visit them after voting. Mid-price brothels surrounded the harbor. The cheapest operated in artisan districts. Each tier followed a pricing system carefully regulated by the state. A night with a first-category slave cost 3 days' wages for a soldier. Second-category women were priced like a full meal. Third-category women cost the price of watered-down wine. Those who were sick, elderly, or pregnant were offered free of charge, framed as a public service. The law protected this system with precision. A woman who refused a client could be publicly whipped. One who attempted escape was branded on the face and sold to gladiatorial arenas. A woman who struck a client, even in self-defense, could be executed immediately, without trial, without record. Yet the law also imposed protections for the enslaved themselves. It was forbidden to permanently injure them without the owner's consent. In other words, Athenian law protected sexual slaves exactly as it protected any other form of private property, not because they were human, but because they had market value. All of this unfolded while the greatest philosophers in human history debated justice just meters away. Socrates never publicly challenged a system that reduced half the population to instruments of use. Plato accepted slavery as necessary. Aristotle argued that some people, especially women and foreigners, were slaves by nature, and that using them sexually was as natural as using tools to build. The contradiction was structural. Athenian democracy functioned only because the majority of labor was delegated to people without rights, voice, or legal existence. The freedom of some rested entirely on the absolute unfreedom of others. Most did not live beyond 25. Their bodies were destroyed by years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced abortions with crude instruments, and psychological damage. Eventually, they simply stopped resisting. There were no cemeteries for sex slaves, no funeral rites, no names carved in stone. Most bodies were dumped into the Barathron, a deep pit outside Athens where executed criminals and animal remains were thrown. Others were sold, even after death, to medical schools where students practiced dissections. Even in death, their bodies continued to serve the intellectual progress of the civilization that had destroyed them. Those who survived past usefulness were pushed into illegal brothels hidden in cellar basements where conditions were so brutal that death was often a release. Pregnant women gave birth in the same rooms where they worked, sometimes between clients. Their daughters were absorbed into the system immediately. There was no separation between birth and bondage. Life began already assigned a price. And throughout this entire process, Athenian society maintained staggering hypocrisy. The same laws that fiercely protected the sexual virtue of citizen women, imposing death penalties on anyone who dishonored them, simultaneously legitimized the sexual enslavement of everyone else. An Athenian citizen who raped the wife of another citizen could be executed on the spot. That same man could violate 100 enslaved women in a single night and remain a respected participant in civic life. Before we continue, if this story is opening your eyes to the dark side of ancient civilizations, subscribe to Ancient Grim History and turn on notifications. Aristotle argued that the difference between a wife and a sexual slave was the same as the difference between a musical instrument and a work tool. A wife was like a lyre, designed to produce harmony. A sexual slave was like a hammer, meant to satisfy basic needs. Pleasure without consequence. Use without responsibility. Centuries later, when Christian emperors closed the last brothels, when the system collapsed into dust, the monuments built with their suffering still remained. The Parthenon had been financed in part through taxes levied on their pain. The theater of Dionysus had been the setting for systematic, ritualized sexual violence. Even today, 25 centuries later, millions walk among these ruins without knowing what paid for them. They admire white marble without asking how much blood purchased it. They celebrate Greek philosophy without questioning how theories of human dignity were developed alongside the routine dehumanization of half the population. There is no innocent beauty when it is built on suffering. There is no pure wisdom when it coexists with brutality. Classical Athens gave us democracy, philosophy, theater, and architecture that define Western culture. But it also gave us the clearest demonstration that humanity's greatest achievements can coexist with its most extreme crimes. This is the story of thousands of women who lost their humanity so that a civilization could preserve its glory. Bodies burned with iron so other bodies could be immortalized in marble. Voices erased forever so other voices could echo through history. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Athens has been told by those who praised its greatness while ignoring its brutality. Today, every time the cradle of democracy is invoked, every time the Greek miracle is celebrated, it is worth remembering that this miracle carried a price. And that price was paid with the bodies and lives of thousands of women whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose voices we will never hear, but whose story finally deserves to be told. Civilizations do not die when their temples fall. They die when their moral contradictions become impossible to sustain. Athens was not destroyed by barbarians. It was undone by a system that demanded the absolute enslavement of many to preserve the freedom of a few. If this video made you think differently about ancient Athens, drop a comment below and tell me what part shocked you the most. And if you want more dark truths from history that no one talks about, subscribe to Ancient Grim History, because the past is far grimmer than they taught you in school.